Hello, lovelies. Welcome to Horror 421, the podcast, with your host, your friendly small-town horror author, Charles Campbell. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the frights in this week's episode.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Horror 421, the podcast. Today, I have a very special guest. He is a returning guest. Had him on last year, and he is a very prolific author. He writes all kinds of stuff. He has books that run the gamut of all the way from young readers to old guys like me. So, thank you for coming back to the show, Jeff. We really appreciate it.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
Man, yeah. Well, I have. Read I think it's your latest book. It may not be your latest book, so you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's in stores everywhere. It's called It Watches in the Dark, and I quite enjoyed that. It is marketed to young readers, but anyone can pick this up and enjoy it. So congrats on this new release.
Thank you. Yes, it is indeed my most recent book.
Awesome. Well, for the people that didn't watch the podcast last year, if you could give the listening audience a little brief overview of who you are and how you got into writing, and then we'll go from there.
I'm Jeff Strand. I pretty much have always wanted to be a writer. I don't have a good origin story because it's just always been there. So there was no, lightning bolt eureka moment like this is what I want to do. It's always been there. So, but I did, when I was a kid, I wanted to be a comedy writer. And that sort of continued into young adult. And then I got into horror pretty much in high school. And then that sort of took over what I write. So I'm mostly known for my mix of horror and comedy. I've done some books that are just pure comedies. And then I've done some books that are less on the humor side of the humor-horror equation. But for the most part, if someone says, what does Jeff Strand write? It's like, oh, he's the horror comedy guy. So that's primarily what I'm known for.
Well, I missed something in my introduction. You are a Bram Stoker award-winning author, so I wanted to put that in there.
Yeah, I had a long losing streak and finally broke it with my novella 20th anniversary screening.
Well, that's awesome, man. We talked about it a little bit on last year's podcast, but how did it feel to shatter the Susan Lucci award for the Bram Stoker for the Bram Stoker Award? You were up so many times, and I think I remember you saying that in the last podcast. But how did it feel to finally get that award?
It was cool. It was kind of a blur. Like, I thought I had about a 2% chance of winning, which is better than some of the other years where I thought I had a 0% chance. So it wasn't like every year I thought this could be my year, this could be my year, and then my heart was broken. Every year was, it's not going to be me this time, and I was correct. And this time I thought, okay, it's not a 0% chance, but I have very little chance. I had a very strong opinion about who was going to win, and it wasn't me. So when I heard my name called, it's like, oh, you know what, a speech would have been nice to write, and I have very little memory of the actual what I said or what happened after that. So it was pretty cool. I don't take awards too seriously, but they are fun. I'm certainly not I could care less that I won. I was very happy to win, but yeah, it was kind of a surreal, unexpected blur.
Well, I've read a few of your books now. I have, I've barely dipped my toe in the water with all the stuff you have out there. I think you have over like 50 published books that you've written. It may be over 60 by now. I'm not sure, but I know it's
creeping up on
50.
60. I'm not there quite yet, but I'm getting very close.
So Attack of the Killer Tomatoes. I'm going to jump around a little bit. Tell me how you got that gig. I got a copy. I read it. I enjoyed it. But, let's refresh our listening audience of how you got that. How did you get that opportunity? Because you did a fantastic job, by the way.
It was just supposed to be an amusing tweet. All I said was, how is it possible that no one has hired me to do a novelization of Attack of the Killer Tomatoes? Not thinking it would actually turn into the job, thinking people would say, that would be great. I'd love to see that. But it was just supposed to be amusing. And then Encyclopocalypse Publications contacted me and said, if you're serious, I'll see what I can do. It's like, oh, sure. Yeah, I'm serious. And then a few weeks later, I was in a Zoom call with the filmmakers, and I described my vision for the book, which was I'm going to do this as if you guys had Marvel Cinematic Universe money to make the original movie. And they liked the idea. Their only request was that I keep it as family friendly as the movies are. So, it wasn't ever going to be a hard R Attack of the Killer Tomatoes, which is what I wouldn't have done anyway. And so then I was basically just turned loose to write the book, and I tried to keep it, do my own thing with it, but keep it loyal scene by scene to the movie until it's not. It diverges pretty heavily in the last third of the book. But I wanted it to be more of a companion piece than a novelization, because if you want to watch Attack of the Killer Tomatoes, the movie and all of its jokes are readily available to anyone who wants to see it. So I wanted to expand on it. So it doesn't use their jokes unless it springboards to my own joke. It is Attack of the Killer Tomatoes. It's loyal to the tone. It's just as dumb as the movie is. But I tried to bring a lot of my own stuff into it. And they loved
Yeah,
it. The filmmakers were
I can attest to that. I really enjoyed it. And, you did put your own spin. The jokes were funny, and I enjoyed the book. So, guys, go check out Attack of the Killer Tomatoes. Jeff did a great job with that. Like I said, I'm going to bounce around a little bit. I'm going to come back to, because it's your most recent release, It Watches in the Dark. And it centers around, a pair of twins, Oliver and Tricia, who are going a camping trip with their dad, or a canoeing trip with their dad. And I forget the name of the river they were on. I think it was Champion River. And they have an accident, and the dad gets injured. And then it kind of goes from there. What brought that story to you? I really enjoyed it. I thought it was really well written, and I love the way it ended. I loved everything about it, and the cover kicked so much ass. I can't even, I'm going to use the cover image as the podcast graphic so people can see it, but it's an amazing cover. So I'm going to be quiet and let you talk about It Watches in the Dark for just a couple minutes.
It Watches in the Dark came from, I had an existing relationship with Sourcebooks, and I wrote like 5 young adult comedies for them. And then my editor, Annette Pollard Morgan, asked if I'd be interested in, aging down just a bit to middle grade and doing horror novels. It's like, sure. So the way it works with Sourcebooks is you pitch them several ideas, and then they sort of meet as a group and decide which ones they like best. So I pitched several ideas, including It Watched in the Dark, which was the scariest of them. The others were more in my horror comedy vein, and this was the more straightforward, scary one, and that's the one they liked the best. I came up with the idea just because a lot of times my book ideas start with, okay, what horror subgenre or trope haven't I done yet? In this case, I'd never done folk horror in a book form. So, okay, what can I do with folk horror? And then I sort of came up with the idea of the small village that worships this giant scarecrow that's in the village square. And so then I just sort of built the story from there. But yeah, the inspiration, like a lot of them, just comes from what haven't I done before. The second book from Sourcebooks is Nightmare in the Backyard. That'll be out this August. And that came from, I've never done Lovecraftian horror. So what can I do with that? I usually start with what haven't I done, and then what kind of insane spin can I put on it?
Well, I really enjoyed It Watches in the Dark, and I'll definitely check out Nightmare in the Backyard. And It Watches in the Dark is available just about everywhere. I mean, I walked into Walmart and they have copies there. I'm sure you can pick them up in bookstores. Anywhere you can find books, you can probably find It Watches in the Dark. So I ordered the hardcover edition, but the paperbacks are also available in Walmart. And I'm sure you can probably get them from Jeff's website, and I'll put links below for sure. Now, I have questions from a super fan. So I've done a little digging, and you have a big fan base. And this guy actually wanted to be on the podcast today and co-host. He had some questions for you, but his schedule wouldn't allow it. He's an author himself. His name is Bruce Haney. And I'm going to hit you up with the first question he sent me. He said, is there a genre or a story that you want to write, but would take too much time to research or didn't think there's an audience for? So is there something out there that you maybe wanted to do and because of circumstances you didn't?
Yeah, I would like to do a historical horror. And, I've I did one of my more recent books is Autumn Bleeds into Winter, and that takes place in 1979 in Fairbanks, Alaska. And I lived in Fairbanks, Alaska in 1979. The lead character is older than I was, but it's still, I was there at the time. And even then, writing about a time that I lived through in a place where I was living at that time, there's a ton of research that goes into it. And so if I were to say I'm going to write something set in the 1920s, in Africa in the 1920s, there's a huge amount of research that would go into it. And so it's like, okay, well, I could start a book that's going to take me 10 times as long to write as a normal book, or I could write something set, in 2024 in Tennessee and make things easier for myself. So yeah, because my ability to be a full-time writer involves putting out quite a few books, I have to be prolific to not crawl back to a day job. So yeah, the historical thing is something that would take a lot of time. That would have to be my book for the year. So I haven't really tackled that, though I would love to.
Well, that's a great answer. And we're going to go through some of Bruce's questions here. Again, Bruce Haney is a super fan, so thank you for sending these in, Bruce. The next question he had was, do you have any plans for any other nonfiction books? Yeah, he pointed out you have the Writing Life Reflections, Recollections, and a lot of cursing. Do you have any, plans of another nonfiction book in your future?
I have toyed around with various ideas. At this point, I'm not actively working on anything. I had come up with some notes for a sequel to The Writing Life, but it's not something I'm actively pursuing right now. Nonfiction for me takes a lot longer than fiction. I've tried to come up with fun ideas. What kind of movie-related book can I do? But at this point, I'm kind of just focusing more on the fiction stuff because the nonfiction takes a lot longer for me.
Well, I mean, that makes sense. It should take a lot longer for most writers probably because of the research involved, and you're coming up the story in fiction. It's your world, so you're controlling everything. But
right,
yeah, I get it. We talked about Attack of the Killer Tomatoes just a few minutes ago, but are there any other novelizations that you're looking at possibly doing in the future? Anything else you would maybe write as a companion?
Not necessarily. Attack of the Killer Tomatoes was kind of this rare thing where I could be just as insane as I wanted, and nobody is saying, hey, the character of Finletter wouldn't behave like that in Attack of the Killer Tomatoes. It was something where I had free reign. The movie is 45 years old, and it was kind of a perfect match. I could just make it as funny as I wanted and just, have a lot of fun with it. There aren't that many other movies where I could do a novelization and have that level of freedom. I think I'd be more inclined to do a spin-off novel. So not necessarily like a novelization of The Evil Dead, but if they said, we'd like you to write an Evil Dead tie-in novel, I would be all over that. I would love to do a Texas Chainsaw Massacre tie-in, pretty much any of the major horror franchises. If it was a spin-off novel instead of an adaptation of one of the movies, I would be all over that. So if anyone with the rights to the Evil Dead franchise wants me to do a tie-in novel, I am available and ready to drop everything else and get started.
Well, that's actually a great idea. That would be amazing. And for me, Evil Dead Rise was kind of that way anyway. It was kind of a tie-in. They set it in a completely different backdrop, and I was a big fan of the Evil Dead franchise, and the Evil Dead Rise didn't change my mind at all. I don't know how you felt about the film particularly, but I really enjoyed it.
Oh, I loved it.
Yeah, I did too. So I could definitely get on board with something like that. Some sort of spinoff. That would be, yeah, I would pluck my money down first to read that, Jeff. Oh, man. So another Bruce question. This is the Bruce Haney podcast today, by the way, ladies and gentlemen. How close are we getting? How close are we to getting a sequel to Freaky Briefs? And he has a little note here. Each of his newsletters has a piece of flash fiction. When he had enough, he put them together into a great book called Freaky Briefs. So that's the little backdrop on Freaky Briefs. But are we close to getting a sequel to that?
Uh, no, I don't think we are. I have a spreadsheet, which I'm not going to pull up now where I keep track of that, but I think we're at least a couple of years away from it. Basically, Freaky Briefs had 75 stories, and about 60 of them came from the newsletter. Then I hit a point where I just thought, okay, if I write another 15, I can have this book out. But the newsletter, when it comes out about once a month, that it takes quite a while to build up enough material for it. So at some point, I'll just say, all right, I'm just going to write the remaining stories and get another 75 story collection out. But at this point, Freaky Beefs 2 is a long ways from happening.
All right.
Although I encourage everyone to just read it bit by bit and subscribe to my newsletter, and then you get the free stories there. So
Cool. Awesome. I'm going to get off Bruce for a little bit. He has a couple more questions, but you and I are very close in age. I was born in 69, and I read your bio. You were born in 70, so we're from the same generation. I'd like to know some of your influences coming up. When you got into writing, I know you say you've been writing all your life, and I probably know some of them. But what were some of your influences in literature and or film and entertainment? Those things coming up. What influenced you to lean towards the horror genre?
Well, as a really young kid, it wasn't so much influences as just stuff I liked to write. I really
Mhm.
loved, Choose Your Adventure. I loved Encyclopedia Brown. I loved all the, Beverly Cleary books. But those weren't, I like to read a lot. And it
I love the
wasn't
Three
like, oh,
Investigators. Yep. Yep.
so it wasn't influencing me. It was just stuff that I really liked to read. More of an influence was magazines. There's a magazine for kids called Dynamite, which I enjoyed, but they had a magazine for slightly older kids that was way stupider called Bananas. And actually, R.L. Stein was the editor of that and one of the writers, and that was just very juvenile, goofy humor aimed at kids. It was sort of like Mad Magazine, but more kid friendly. So Bananas would have gross out humor, but they wouldn't have anything inappropriate for kids, whereas Mad was the kind of
Right.
magazine that your parents would hide. So Bananas was a pretty big influence on me, but that was just dumb stuff. I didn't think you could ever make a career writing this. And then I read Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I was like, whoa, you could do that. I didn't know that was allowed to be that silly in book form. So that was kind of the mind-blowing, influential thing where I realized, oh yeah, you can be really stupid. Because this was back when I just wanted to write pure comedies. And then Dave Barry, because I enjoyed newspaper humor columnists, but it was generally very mild stuff. And it was, gosh, isn't it crazy when you have to stay on hold for however long? Ha ha, boy, the more foibles of modern living. It was that kind of stuff. And then Dave Barry was just insane. He was stupid. He was immature, really goofy. And so then kind of like the 1-2 punch of Dave Barry and Douglas Adams was a big influence. And then I later, in terms of movies, got really into Monty Python and the Zucker Brothers movies. So I would, watch The Naked Gun over and over and over and, chart it out. All right, how many jokes are they doing per minute? Okay, this minute has 5 jokes. This minute has 3 jokes. Okay, what counts as an actual joke? And so I would just analyze those movies to death. And so that's when I started to get into more pacing type stuff where it's like, all right, I want to write stuff that is just joke, 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 joke. And that's when I wasn't that interested in horror. I was just pure comedy. So those were sort of where the influences came from. The actual horror influences didn't really creep in until much later, where, I discovered Stephen King, loved him, didn't really consider him an influence, but loved his work, loved Dean Koontz, loved Robert McCammon. It was kind of when I read Richard Lehman and said, wow, he's allowed to do because I always like to do stuff that had very little description. I'm kind of like no need to just spend any time describing the characters. Let's just get to the story. I did a lot of dialogue. I thought I was doing it wrong because, Stephen King had lots of description. Dean Koontz had lots of
Oh yeah.
description.
Yeah.
And then I read Richard Lehman and he was just like, the guy's name was Fred. And then here's what Fred did. And so I realized, hey, I kind of write like that guy and he's published and he's popular. So I guess I'm doing it right. So I feel like Lehman was less of an influence than he was just confirming that what I was doing was okay. But yeah, he was the one whose writing style was closest to mine, so I became a huge Lehman fan.
Yeah, well, that's one thing I struggled with super early on, being way too descriptive. It's like, and it's directly from Stephen King. Trying to describe every little detail in a room. You don't need to do all that.
I'd probably
But
take it too far in the other direction, where I was like, all right, I'll be going through a book and realize, oh, I didn't give any description of the main character. You have to give something, and so then I'll
yeah.
go back and edit. But
Oh man. So I'm going to go back to another Bruce question. He said, when you were younger, you used to write screenplays. Did any of those end up as books? So did anything turn into a book from a screenplay?
no, not really. I had a bunch of original scripts, and I took pieces of some of them, but very little. There's not, if you were to read, the first dozen or so scripts I wrote as a kid, you wouldn't really see much of any of it in my work. And I'm still doing screenplays. Most of it is sort of behind the scenes stuff that I'm not allowed to talk about, but the movie
Okay.
business is insane. So I have to keep my focus on writing books. But yeah, I've still been doing screenplays. I'm actually a WGA member, but that hasn't yet turned into movies that you can sit in the theater and watch. But I keep working toward it.
Well, I'm going to switch gears on you just a little bit. Now, I told you how much I enjoyed It Watches in the Dark. It's a great book, and it's an excellent book for younger readers and adults alike. My good friend, he's also he's a young adult author. His name is Bryce Gibson, and he loves scarecrows. He has an obsession with scarecrows. So after this podcast today, I'm actually going to go to Walmart and buy him a paperback copy of this book so he can check it out. But let's talk about Nightmare in the Backyard for a few moments. If you could kind of set that up and let our listening audience know kind of what it's about. I mean, we talked about it a little bit briefly earlier, but if we can get a little deeper into it so we know what to expect when it comes out.
Nightmare in the Backyard is three preteen girls, and they decide they're going to just have a fun sleepover in the backyard. And they set up the tent, and then they realize that something is squirming underneath the tent, which turns out to be tentacles. There's something underneath the ground of the backyard that is trying to get them. And that one sort of combines, I hadn't done Lovecraftian horror, like I said, but I also wanted to do single location, almost real time horror. So if you did this as a movie version, it would be, an hour and a half taking place over about an hour and a half. I wanted it to be, it never leaves the backyard and is just, crisis after crisis after crisis, and see how much bad stuff I could throw at these characters over their one night in that sleepover.
Wow. Yeah, and I saw the cover. It looked amazing too. Where do you get your how much input? Like, I'm going to go back to It Watches in the Dark for a second. How much input do you have on the cover design? Is this like an idea that you have and you put out there for the designer, or do you just kind of give them an overview of what you're looking for? Because I really love this cover, and like I said, I'm going to make it the backdrop for this podcast. Can you tell me a little bit about the origin of this cover in particular?
This one, and the cover is by David Seidman, and he did both this one. He did Nightmare in the Backyard, and he's going to do the third book, Finders Keepers, which will be turned in probably before this podcast goes live. So he's done all three of the covers. They asked for a little bit of feedback from me, but mostly it's the Sourcebooks marketing department. Mm-hmm. And then they have him do 4 rough sketches of completely different concepts, and then they sort of market research. They send to me, which one do you like best? But mine is not, whatever I prefer is not the one they're going to pick. It goes through market research, and then once they've decided, okay, this one is testing the best, then he does the full-on painted version. So I have some involvement, but if you're praising, David Seidman for his work on the cover, the praise goes to him, not to me, because awesome. It's not my idea. I basically said, I want a scarecrow on the cover, and we did a really cool one. But yeah, I can take very little credit for how great that one turned out.
Yeah, it looks really good, man. It would be a great poster on a wall. So I don't know. Maybe consider putting some posters out there. I'd put this on my wall for sure. It's pretty rad, as one of my favorite singers would say. All right, so we're gonna go back to Bruce. Shout out Bruce Haney. Um, he says, "I see your book, The Odds, is in the running for the Book of Horror Indie Brawl. Is this your first? Is this the first time your book has been entered? And what can you tell us about the brawl?"
The Brawl is something, it's the second time they've done it, and it's through Books of Horror, and which is a really, really popular Facebook group. And so it has made stars out of some indie book authors, and you basically you can enter one novel into the Brawl, and someone had said, you have to enter the odds. And I hadn't entered the first year, and they thought, well, if this guy wants me to enter the odds, I'll go ahead and do it. And then they basically divided into multiple rounds. And I think I don't remember how many books were in the first round, but it was, I think over 100 books got whittled down to the 32 that are going to be in the actual Brawl. And so it's membership voting. So the first one was just whatever the top books are in each round, make it to the final 32. And now it's going to be one-on-one type book. So it'll be, all right, The Odds versus this book by Megan Stockton. The members of Books of Horror will vote. Whichever one of us wins moves on to the next bracket. So it'll sort of be 2 books at a time. And then finally a winner will be crowned. I'm expecting The Odds to get knocked out fairly early in the process, but we'll see. And it's a fun thing. The Books of Horror members vote on it. It's a bigger deal than I realized, because they're doing a lot of promo for the Brawl and the 32 books that are in there. But, in the end, only one will emerge victorious, and it probably won't be me, but we'll see.
Well, you never know. You never know. So Books of Horror, we can find that on Facebook.
Right.
So we'll check that out for sure. Is something you can join? Can we join the Books of Horror? And awesome.
Yep.
Well,
And
some places
it is a very, very active group. Don't go to it if you don't want, to be part of a really active book discussion.
Oh, that's right up my alley. So
and it is purely books. They don't do movie discussion or video game discussion. It is very emphatically a horror books discussion.
Awesome. All right, listeners, check it out. Books of Horror on Facebook. I'm definitely going to go check it out and heed his warning. Be ready to discuss books and all things book related. So another question I have for you, you've got so many books out there, and my favorite, even after I've read these other books that I've read, my favorite is still Blister. I keep going back to that. Is there, and I know this is going to be a hard question to answer, but do you have a top 2 or 3 in your mind of books that you've written, some of your favorites? And I know they're all like your kids if you're like me. But are there a couple that stand out for emotional or sentimental reasons?
It changes all the time. And, so if you ask me this question tomorrow, I'd probably give a different answer. But Blister tends to be in my top 3 pretty frequently. I think that's one of the ones that just I enjoy the most. Probably because it covers so much different territory. I think it's one of my funnier books, but I think I like the mystery. I think like the action. I think it's just one of them that I'm the most proud of. Dweller is not one of my favorites of my own, but that's probably the one I'm the most proud of in terms of, having written it. It's been a fan favorite for a long time. It came out in 2010, but that's still one of the most popular ones that I've written. Not necessarily my favorite, but one that I'm the most proud of. Cyclops Road. Sometimes if people say, all right, narrow it down to one book that's your favorite, a lot of times I will settle on Cyclops Road, which is more on the dark fantasy side, but it's probably my biggest, most ambitious book. So that's another one of my favorites. But it changes, at any given time. When people say, "What book do you recommend I start with?" I'll usually say something like The Odds or Allison. I think those are the more mainstream friendly ones. I'm not going to tell anyone to start with Fangboy, which is one of my favorites, but it's also one of the weirdest and most divisive of all of them. So some people absolutely love it. Some people say it is my crowning achievement. Other people are like, "What the hell did I just read?" So
Oh, I laugh because I have a book like that. It's called Just Breathe. And if you go look at my Amazon reviews for that, like one of the first reviews is, "This just isn't my cup of tea." And it's like, what the hell did I just, and the other people love it. So yeah, that one's kind of out there, but that's awesome. So what advice can you give people who want to make, make their career as a writer? I, like you said earlier, I have a full-time day job, and I really didn't start getting serious with this until I was in my 40s. But I love it. It's a release for me more than anything. But what can you advise younger folks coming up who want to make a career out of being a writer? You are very prolific, and you have so many books out there. I'd love for you to share that insight.
just write. It doesn't cost you anything but time, and you don't need to be in a hurry to get published. I think, when I started out, you didn't have a choice. Like, you had gatekeepers. You would send your books to agents or editors, and, you had to impress them to get published. Now you can have a book up 12 hours after it's done, but you don't necessarily want to do that. I'm all for indie publishing. In Watch in the Dark, that's a full publisher. That's Source Books. That's a big publisher. It's in Walmart and everything. But most of my work is indie published. I love self-publishing. So, if I finish a book, I can have, I don't have any gatekeepers. I can have the book up whenever I want to. But I've been doing this for a long time. I've got the infrastructure where I've got the test readers and that kind of thing, where I know that there is some quality control happening. But if it's your first book and your mom thinks it's amazing, you may want to, let's hold off. But don't be in a rush. It's fine to have practice books. If you're learning a sport or a musical instrument, you're not going to get good at it right away. And that's the same with writing. You may need to, crank out several books before you write one that you say, "Okay, this is publishable," because you don't want a book out there that is garbage. And a lot of writers, have disavowed their early work, where it's like, "Oh, I wish I had never published that one. I wish I had started later." But just write. And my thought is, if you are submitting to editors and agents, start on the next one. Don't wait to hear what they thought of the first one. Just write as much as you can. But also have a life, and also, be responsible. And, if you need a day job to feed your family, do that too. I had a day job for a really long time before I could quit, and there's nothing wrong with that. So,
well, that's great advice. That is great advice. Unlike you, I've only, I started in my early 40s, and I'm 55 now, and I really enjoy the heck out of it. But for me, and this may sound strange, for me, it's more of self-enjoyment. I love that people read the stuff and they like it, or I even like it when they dislike it. They tell me why. I had one reviewer say, "I was really enjoying this book until I discovered it was about devils," and and she said, "I'm not going to finish it now." And I wanted to go correct her. It's not a devil, it's a demon, but it's all right. But yeah, it just get some satisfaction out of it. But that's some great advice for people who want to get into it. Are you a fan of writers groups? Were you a part of any writers groups, and are you a part of any writers groups?
I'm not at the moment. When I lived in Atlanta, we had the Horror Writers Association Atlanta chapter. So I was pretty active in that, mostly for the social aspect. I'm not a part of any formal writers groups. I don't have a critique group. I have test readers for my stuff, but I'm not a big fan of the let's sit around and offer notes,
Yeah.
which has worked wonders for some people. I don't really enjoy it. I need the social aspect. so I love going to conventions. I love hanging out with other horror writers and that kind of stuff. But I'm not a member of like a critique group or anything like that. And now that I'm living in Minnesota, I don't have a HWA chapter nearby, so I'm just kind of doing everything online. But no, I'm not I'm not saying critique groups are bad. I'm saying I don't enjoy them, but for many people, they work great.
Well, I'm kind of in the same boat. There was a couple writer groups here, and I've kind of felt the same way about sitting around the table and critiquing each other's work. It wasn't that it was bad. It's just, it wasn't to steal from the reviewer. It wasn't my cup of tea, actually. Um, but you mentioned conventions, and I looked at your schedule. You do have some things coming up later this summer. If you want to kind of talk about the conventions and some of the places you're going to be, please share that with the audience. Maybe we can see you somewhere.
Yeah, let me pull up my website real quick because I needed to remember what I'm doing.
And I will put links below to the website as well.
Yeah, if you go to my website and click on 2024 appearances, like I'm doing right now, yeah, I'll be in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, May 25th for a horrifying book fair. I think that's a first-time event. Books and Brews is a Books of Horror sponsored event. That's in Evanston, Illinois, August 3rd. That is shaping up to be gigantic. That's the first year for it. All indications are that it's going to be just a really crazy, insane, popular event. So I'm really looking forward to that one. Got Killer Con, which is in Austin, Texas. That's August 9th through 11th. That's one that I would never miss. Rath James Wright runs that one, and it's very small, but it's just a lot of fun. And they have the gross out contest. They've got all kinds of stuff. That's probably, and just in terms of enjoyment, that's my favorite convention that I go to every year. I've got TBR Con in Knoxville, Tennessee, September 6th or 8th. I think that's another first year one. That's more of a book selling event. I think there will be panels and stuff, but that's more where you're signing books for anyone who wants to bring them up and trying to sell stuff. There's going to be a second Author Con, which is in St. Louis. So Author Con has always been in Williamsburg, Virginia. Now they've got a second one in St. Louis. And so I'm hoping that one will be just as good as the other Author Cons. Brownsville Screams, I'm doing that September 13th. That's a small event in Brownsville, Pennsylvania. And then right after that, I'm going to Brian Keene's bookstore, Vortex. So I'll be doing a signing there with Bridget Nelson, Amanda Headley, and Larry Hinkle. So the four of us will just be signing in a Brian Keene and Mary San Giovanni's horror bookstore. I've got the Fright Reads Book Festival, which has been going on for a few years, but this will be my first one at that one. That's in Columbia, Maryland, and that's should be a lot of fun. That'll be my first time attending. And then this one is the Nightmares. It's not a convention. It's the Nightmares Film Festival, which I've been to a couple times. I'm going to be there this year I don't have a movie there, but I'll be there as a screenwriter, just giving a talk on screenwriting. And that's in Columbus, Ohio. And that's a really, really good horror film festival. And all this stuff is on my website.
Yep. And I will put links below. Wow, Jeff, I am definitely an admirer of yours. Definitely a fan, and I want to make sure that as many people as possible that listen to my little podcast can get wind of you, because you do some amazing things. You're a very, very talented guy, and I really appreciate you being on the podcast today.
Oh, absolutely.
And we did a little plugging there, but if there's anything else you want to plug before we close this thing out, we talked about your website, we talked about It Watches in the Dark, we talked about Nightmare in the Backyard, but if there's any other thing you want to plug or promote, I'm going to be quiet another couple minutes and let you do that before we close out the show today.
I think we've plugged pretty heavily. I guess if someone is skipping to the 39-minute mark to get to the good stuff, they missed It Watches in the Dark, which again is available anywhere you choose to buy books. Nightmare in the Backyard, if you're several months late listening to this episode. It's available, it'll be available August 2024. So that might be at a bookstore near you now, or if you listen to the podcast live like you're supposed to, then it's got a few months. And that will be followed by Finders Keepers in April 2025. So those are my middle grade books. One of my more recent books is Creep Out, which came out just a little bit before Watch in the Dark. That's my contribution to the evil ventriloquist dummy subgenre.
Yeah.
That's one where I was actually trying to be as scary as I could. So that's about a guy who inherits a ventriloquist dummy named Virgil when his father dies, and it turns out the dummy is alive and evil, and he finds himself trapped in a ravine with it, and things go very poorly.
I'm definitely going to check that out. That sounds like it's right up my alley.
So that is Creep Out. That's available. That's, if you go to www.jeffstrand.com, you can find that, but it's on Amazon. And I think that's it for the plugging. I think,
okay.
My website covers all, and listen for my next appearance on Horror 421 at some point in the undetermined future.
Yeah, we definitely want to have you back. And next time we're going to get Bruce on here. Bruce is a super fan, so he was a little bit bummed that he couldn't be on the show.
Well, he had good questions. Usually it's like, here's a super fan. Now we're going to have obnoxious questions to completely derail the conversation. But those were good, insightful questions. So
yeah, Bruce is a great author.
Bruce.
Yeah, he's a great author in his own right. Thank you again, Jeff, for being on the show. My name is Charles Campbell. I'm a small-town horror author. I want to be Jeff Strand when I grow up. My latest release is called The Piano Witch. You can find it at valleyboypublications.com. Along with all of my other books, you can find links to Horror 421, the podcast, and Backstage 421, the podcast. I also host a Musicians Only podcast, so you can check that out. So, again, thank you, Jeff, for being on, and we'll see you next time on Horror 421, the podcast.
All right. Thanks for having me.
We hope you had a horrific time, lovelies. Thank you for tuning in to Horror 421, the podcast. Be sure to like us on YouTube and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.